Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Brown Girl Green. I'm Christy Drutman, and I interview environmental leaders and advocates about how they work to address workplace and member diversity. I am working to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. And so I am joined here today with...
Hi, everyone. It's me, Jose Gonzalez. Jose Guadalupe Donis Gonzalez Rosales de León.
Ooh, that's a mouthful! And I just wanted to introduce the amazing work Jose does. So, Jose is an experienced educator as a K-12 public education teacher, environmental education advisor, outdoor education instructor, coordinator, and a university adjunct faculty member. He is also a partner at the Avarna Group and is a consultant at large on equity, inclusion, and diversity and intersectionality within the outdoors. He is a founding member of the Parks Now Coalition, the Next 100 Coalition, and the founder of Latino Outdoors. And I am super excited to have him on my show because he is just killing it when it comes to representation of color within the outdoor and environmental movement. So I just wanted to start off by thank you for coming on to my show. And I just wanted to start off with wanting to know the origin story of Latino Outdoors. Where did it come from? What was your idea behind it? How do you think it's evolved now?
Definitely. So Latino Outdoors has a few strands in its origin. First and foremost, the basic question started for me was like, I'm looking for others like me. And what does that mean? So it meant understanding what kind of like cultural identity I hold as a Latino and how that related to the cultural identity of like loving and enjoying the outdoors. While knowing that came out of this mix. I'm an immigrant from Mexico, so it's like bringing that over and then connecting to what the outdoor experience and culture here in the U.S. And wondering like, okay, where is everybody else? Like literally the question used to be, where you all meet? It's like, well, what does that mean? And this is early days of, even social media. So I was looking on Facebook for like, what's a Facebook group for like Latinos that like the outdoors and finding nothing. And I had a peer, my colleague Marce, kind of say, well, start something. And I know, well, what is that something? Is it a group? Is it a club? Is it an organization? Like, what is it? And the other two seeding parts to that were, I was part of an outdoor ed program, and I had one of my instructors and colleagues kind of said, hey, I want to do this. Like, where do I apply? Like, who do I connect with? What's the network? And I had no idea. Now I have a better sense of being able to say, look at all these amazing people you can connect with. And so I was looking both for the community in which to belong. And I was also curious about like, well, what is, we used to joke, what is the Latino Sierra Club? Like, where is that organization?
Yeah.
And why is that needed? Or is it needed at all? Or where are the professionals in the space that connect with it? And so it literally started with me buying the domain name and putting my story out there and having that be the starting point for people connecting back.
That's awesome. That is just like a hustler mindset, just coming up with a creative idea to build community. I love that so much. And so like, what was like the first group of people who joined? Like, what did that look like?
Great question. So, you asked at the beginning, like, where's Latino Outdoors now? So it's an exciting time, to be honest. So I'm the founder, and I started really as the founding executive director. We now have a new executive director. I've transitioned because we made the commitment for this to continue to grow as an organization. And so for me, because I really want to be much more intentional and focus on the community and movement building and how to grow that space, to be able to respect and hold and leave the space for an organization, that's been the work right now. And it's amazing, right? To know like we created something and how it exists and it's going to continue to move on separate from me, even though it's so integrated with my own identity. And it started literally with like, it's like 5 people in different ways. I mean, you had individuals like Melissa Avery, Eduardo Gonzalez, Leslie Caballero, and then later, of course, Graciela Cabello, that they basically believed, and they were first leaders. Raquel Rangel, who's still one of the regional coordinators for the Central Valley, she's out still there leading hikes, and she was one of the first people that I was telling my idea. And she thought, oh, great, it's all set, right? Like, how can I show? And I was like, no, you don't understand. This is just the idea.
Yeah.
And here we are riding in this van. Yeah, we're going to go on this rafting trip. So that's how it started. These kind of 5 to 6 individuals who said, let's do it. And we got our first grant. And I said, great, here's some money. Go do a hike. That's how it started.
Wow. That's great. And now if you follow Latino Outdoors on Instagram at Latino Outdoors, you can check it out. They're like almost at 12,000 followers on Instagram. That's like impressive. It's, you can tell that people crave this community.
Yeah, and that's important because, we didn't start out with the idea of like, let's be a social media influencer. Like that takes work to get a certain number of followers, and other people have a lot more followers because that is the space to steward. For Latino Outdoors, it's almost like Instagram was a starting place. Like, I think like 90% of the first cohort of volunteers came from Instagram because that's where they saw themselves represented. And then all the volunteers were like, we want to do programs. Like, let's take people outdoors. And it's like, oh, well, that's different work now, because it isn't just like, let's encourage people to go outdoors. Let's like do the representation. That's literally, let's do everything that you need, from risk management to training to, it's like, now we're basically leading people in actual outdoors experiences. So that spread us and grew us out, and it's almost like now we're coming back to the social media space to be able to say like, and look how we're gonna add to that space as well. It's been an interesting journey.
Yeah. And why do you think social media is important to give greater representation for Latino Americans in the outdoors?
Yeah, it's like social media is such a unique and powerful tool that we have right now. And unless you really think about how different it was even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago or before, there has been a history of like all these amazing grassroots organizations, right? And individuals and people with ideas who say like, I want to see myself represented. I am looking for others like me. But they did not have these accessible, much more democratizing tools that we have now. Now you can go on and start an Instagram account with the identity that is important to you and you want to see that. And so it's amazing to see, even within the past 2-3 years, everything from unlikely hikers to brown people camping to Melanin Base Camp, all of these entities that when we started on Instagram, it was basically Latino Outdoors and Outdoor Afro, right? And we're like, where is everybody else? And the exciting piece is now to be able to say, look at the ways in which everybody is saying, here I am, and others can access that so much more easily.
I love that. And how do you feel like Latino Americans, like in some ways have like maybe either have felt fear about embracing the outdoors or like have had barriers to embrace out observations?
Yeah, so it's a 2-part question. The first one is that we've been able to do a lot of work to move from the question of like Latinx individuals and communities, do they care about or engage in the outdoors? And the answer is yes. That's never been a question that they don't. To move into the question of how does that look like? And how is it similar and different than the expectation or how like the mainstream outdoor community does that? Mm-hmm. But that took some work, because even in the past 5 years, so many surveys had finally come out that validate that identity and experience. And at the same time as acknowledging there are a variety of barriers that prevent a diversity and variety of like Latinx identity, community members. And some of it is your standard known barriers, as Dr. Roberts here from San Francisco State says, like, we're done with the barriers. We already know what they are. It isn't about like, are there barriers? Yes, and how you're addressing them. Some of this may be transportation, gear costs. But the most important one, as you mentioned, the fear, is the disconnect from feeling welcome. That if you're entering a space, and what happens to you, how are you invited, how are you made to feel that you're a part of it? And it can go multiple ways, but really on one side you have showing up maybe for the first time in a space or with new people, and either another visitor or maybe staff, maybe a ranger makes you feel unwelcome. Like, what are you doing here? Right? And on the other end, you can literally have like a Latinx ranger come up and just connect with you, even say one word in Spanish, or like check in and see how you're doing. That can make a difference. So that's ultimately the biggest barrier to do that. Everything else falls in between, and you can address it both with seriousness and humor. On the humor side, you have things like, is a bear gonna eat me? Or like, no, like bears actually don't. There are no bears here, right? Like, it's a bear gonna show up in the at the Presidio or Golden Gate, recreation park? Like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
And yet you have to like work with the people to understand, like, well, that fear comes from somewhere, right? So how do we like begin that process to let them know? And rather than like, that's silly, that's that's important, because sometimes we carelessly make people feel like they're dumb for thinking or feeling that, rather than saying it's with humor and let's welcome you to know like that's okay. So let's look at other fears that we can address. So that's been a kind of a fun part to work with.
Wow. And what even got you into outdoor work to begin with?
Yeah, what did get me into outdoor work?
Your origin story.
It's a great question, because I never knew or thought that I would be involved in outdoors, so to speak.
Really?
Right?
Okay.
Honestly, quote unquote, growing up, all the way up until high school, I wanted to be a comic book artist. I thought, like, cool, I'm going to either draw comic books or superheroes or like comic strips, or I didn't know. I just knew I wanted to draw. And that I was going to go to art school, that my major was going to be art, right? None of that happened, by the way.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert, right? Or at least it has not happened yet. But I think what it was that I had some of my first, transformative experiences in 6th grade and later bit in high school, especially in college, visiting some of the first state parks and national parks. Seeing sequoias and redwoods for the first time is just mind blowing.
Oh yeah,
right? It's just like, wow. And I often use the literary term magical realism, which is present in a lot of Latin American literature, as to like, how can you have this sense of the magical, which can incorporate, your ancestors or your elders or like past, present, and future to kind of merge in this physical space. And it's pretty quote unquote normal. It's real, right? It's not fiction. It's not fantasy. It's like it can be the story of your family or like an autobiography, and like you recount this as a very real experience. And to me, that's what like redwoods and sequoias represent. These are amazing magical beings present here, and they're very tangible and real. And but they come with that slight sense of disbelief, right? How can they exist in this space? And they do. And that stuck with me, so that in college, when I was doing an outdoor ed program for migrant students, that kind of got me connected to both physically traveling throughout the state and seeing all of these amazing places, but then also culturally to be like, how else would I have experienced this, and who else gets to experience this, and why, right? If it wasn't for this, would I actually have been supported or have had the connection? And possibly no. I was training to be a teacher, and I did go into teaching, into the classroom teacher, but that idea of nature and the outdoors stuck with me. And it's, pun intended, it was an embedded seed. It planted itself in there, took root, and has not let go. Wow. And so since then, I've just been building on that idea of like, what more is this? So that complementary additive factor of like, how it isn't just like I'm converting myself into a traditional outdoor enthusiast, but how am I changing the space, and the space is changing me in kind. Yeah. I
love that so much. Magical realism. What a concept. And I feel like you give out this aura as we're sitting in this studio right now, that you just seem very like grounded or like connected to like this like inner understanding and like wisdom of like who you are. You just like give that off, like those vibes.
Thank you.
And so I'm just wondering, like, how has been your experience like in the outdoors and like nature allowed you to like reconnect with like deeper parts of yourself?
That's a really good question. A couple of times I've been asked, well, I'll either be doing a workshop presentation or something else. Like I remember like one time people asked me, like, do you meditate? I was like, yeah, I do, right? And they're like, I could tell, because they're like, I would have lost it with that person, but you handle that so calmly. But I say that because, so a couple of things, right? One thing is that we can use terms like literally you can go to a couple state parks or like redwood groves and it's gonna say the cathedral, right? Okay, this grove is XYZ cathedral. Or people will talk about the natural landscape as very spiritually healing and so forth. And unless then you actually put that into practice, then they're just descriptive terms, right? So for me, it's acknowledging that if I'm going to enter an outdoor space or natural space, it's with multiple identities. And I describe it as having like a quantum identity, which means it's a way to hold all of the multitude that are you. And what's going to collapse, what's going to interact and exist with the reality of that moment is going to depend on what you're interacting with. And I walk into this space knowing I'm not just going on this trail, or I'm not just going to go camp out at this location for the practical, like technical skill-based outdoor experience. It's really going to be because there's going to be a sense of presence, of history, of knowledge, but also just a component that, it's like nature is reminding me of so many things at that moment, and all of them are present, right? It's like, I'm not going to get into this conversation or discussion with a tree about like, well, what's next week going to look like? I'm like, is a tree even thinking that? Probably not, right? Like talking to the birds and be like, hey, so what are you anxious about? And they're all like, living? Like, what are you going to say? And so that's how that's so healing. Real. And then on the other end, honestly, is what we're affirming through a lot more research and studies is that nature is healing in all senses of the word. Spiritually, cognitively, physically, it is a literal way to reground ourselves into what it means to be human. And that's why we can say things like, sometimes things need just to be plugged in and out, disconnected, and they'll work again. It's like, that's no different than humans by going out in nature. Like it totally unplugs you from everything our human created spaces to be able to say, oh, this is what it's like to sometimes kind of literally be tuned in back into the universe.
Wow. Yeah, I agree. Whenever I'm, especially in like redwoods, like in the forest, I like find myself just like shutting my brain off and I'm just kind of there. And I feel like I don't have to like be a certain person or like embrace like this prescriptive set of identities. It's like I'm just there in that moment.
No, of course. I mean, the thing is that, and especially in the US, but so many of our human created spaces and landscapes come with reminders, and often they're not the best kind of reminders. Like commercial consumer culture is all about reminding you of things that you think you need or want that you don't actually do. The messaging tends to be comparative about how you're different than someone else, and maybe not always in the best way. They're always about a deficiency component, right? Because it's about having you buy something, not, you don't have a lot of commercials that just come out and say, hey, you're amazing and beautiful, keep being you. And that's it. It usually is like, how would you like to be more amazing and more beautiful? And this is what you need to buy for that, right? And even interacting in our other spaces, there's a lot of little trigger points that come around with judgment and not enough. And whether it's the workspace, what we're working for, what can be competitive, all of that stuff can come out in our human created spaces. But like you said, you can go out in nature and like literally the trees are just there.
Yeah.
Right? You don't look at a tree and begin to say like how you're inferior to that tree.
Yeah.
Or even better. or you don't get that sense of judgment from the creek, right?
Mhm.
And the only challenge is with yourself. Like the mountain does not really care whether you make it to the top or not. It's all you, right? The only things that will remind you of that will be another human. So that's usually what I can also try to think about.
That's wild. And like, I don't know, I find myself like internalizing some like weird shame sometimes where I'm like, oh, I've only been on one backpacking trip ever. But even that's like, that was like last year. Like that was a big deal to me. But it's like, that's all I've really done. I'm not like someone who's like gone to a bunch of different countries and has just like trekked Patagonia, or you know what I mean? And like sometimes I'm just like, am I really like an outdoor person? Like, can I really include green in my name? Like, and it's one of those feelings where it's like there's like obvious reasons why that hasn't occurred in my life, and I want more of that in my life. But yeah, I don't know if you like experience the same, but like backpacking gear is expensive.
Yes.
Rock climbing is expensive. Like, I don't know. So I've just like, it's something that I've really been frustrated about, but want to change in my life. But yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
It's a great question because there's at least two pieces, right? One of them is that, you said it yourself. It's about how do we change the narrative so it's more additive and inclusive. If we default to the narrative that there's only specific ways in which you can be considered a real outdoors enthusiast or practitioner or just participant, then we see that space to be able to say, then if you're not part of that, then you're not it. And that's why it's important. One is for the work that you do, right? To literally have these stories and to put it out there. Because then others can be like, oh, that's just like me. And like, I'm also feeling that. And guess what? That's what makes you normal then. You don't have to feel that you're not the one that's not normal because you're not doing what somebody else is doing. And that's why it matters who's on the cover of Outside Magazine. That's why it matters who's on social media. That's why it matters who gets to be put in these platforms as to what we visually affirm as quote unquote normal. And the answer is we're all normal in that way. And the second piece is that, like to understand that different people and different communities come with different connections and experience to the outdoors, and all of those can be just as valid. So we're not looking at this pyramid of experiences and say, all of these other lower experiences where you just go out to your little park, or even your garden and be like, oh, that's nature too. But the real outdoor experience, it's that like multi-day backpacking.
Yeah.
You're totally secluded. If we actually look at that as a spectrum and to know that all of those are just as valid for the fundamental connection of the benefit of the outdoors, and that nearby nature is just as amazing as the awe of like remote wilderness, that awe of remote wilderness is part of and can come to literally the awe of what's the wild of a city garden. If you really look and pause, it's all there. And similarly, to know that if you're going to go to these remote places, you connect with and want to be grounded in the sense of home and what's close to you. Because that's what's going to get us to care about all these places in the same way. Otherwise, we'd be like, well, if you've never been to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, then why are you going to care about it? Why is it worth protecting?
Yeah.
And yet they're all important in the decision-making that we do. Otherwise, you're right. If we can't get everybody out there, then people are going to be like, then whatever happens to it doesn't matter. So it all has to be connected in that way.
Yeah, I feel like especially as more people are moving into cities and, don't have the ability to just like drive out to a national park for like a whole weekend and things like that. Like, I think it would just be nice for people to communicate like, no, going to a park or going to a city garden, like, and just like really being fully present, shutting off your cell phone, spending like 10 to 15 minutes there, like, and just see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I think, let's stress that point because people can sometimes think how challenging and difficult it is. And it is. It is challenging and difficult, like to go on this multi-day backpacking experience or do adventure sport, for sure. And I said, and like you said, take the challenge to literally be in your backyard city park and be present with that. See how difficult that is. Because if you can also take that challenge meditate, ground yourself, like practice that,
Mhm.
then you can't say, oh, that's the easy stuff. Sometimes that's the hardest of all, because you're taking the responsibility for grounding yourself in the nature of that space in light of all the distractions around you. Sometimes it's easier actually to be out far away because nature is like carrying a lot of the load for you.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, that's super true. I think like we're constantly surrounded by so many distractions like within man-made structures, but if we were able to just like tap into that, like, yeah, that would be intense.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I even struggle with that. Like even when I was like going to school on campus, I would like sit, like we had like this glade on campus and I would sit there for like maybe 20 minutes and I was like, okay, well, you're like in proximity to like all the stresses of your life. And so you're like, you're constantly reminded like, oh, that's what I need to go back to. That's what I need to be doing. So sometimes it is nice to just like be like, okay, I'm going to commit this time to just like get away from all of that. But if you can't do that, then trying to figure out how you fit in between those two worlds is an interesting balance.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, that's wild. And so, I mean, going back to the world of distractions and social media, because
Yes.
I'm just like personally, followers and listeners, in love with his Instagram. He just like has this curated platform that has both, you know, indigenous knowledge, art, representation of people of color in the outdoors, and just like your own story and your own history that you're using your social media platform to like display and talk about. So I just want to know, like, has it always been that way, or like how did you get into just like using social media to like really spread your message in such an effective and powerful way?
Yeah, no, it's I laugh a little bit because it's such a private and such a public question at the same time, right? A social media platform like Instagram, right? It's designed to be visual. It's designed for people to like look and see and like be attracted to or have some engagement to what you're putting up there. And so it's very public in that way, right? You're literally putting it out there. And at the same time, and what you choose to share, it can be very intimate and private, right? Like, this is me. So that balance is important, because some time ago, especially with the start of Latino Outdoors, was an agreement that I would have a public part of me be out there. And at the same time, knowing, well, there's a difference between understanding what you put out there for performance, what you put out there as an incomplete self, and then also what you put out there that is going to be of benefit and value to those that see it. It could all just be pretty pictures. I mean, I could have just chosen to be like, look at me, this is how amazing it is, and this is the other part that you'll never get to see. And we all have, we all have a right to our own privacy and whatnot. But what I made a choice was, and I've gone through several phases. I've actually deleted and deactivated my Instagram account before, and Facebook.
We've all been there. Right? We've all been there.
Not just deactivated, but completely erased. And I remember a colleague says, like, what are you doing? All of the history of like everything is gone. And I was like, yeah, and but it's content. Like, I get to choose that. And recently I made an additional agreement or a re-engagement to be able to say, all right, you've had a few years of like navigating this space, and some of it you knew was coming, some of it you had no idea. Today, in fact, I met with a mentor, an elder, who she was one of the first people I met with before starting Latino Outdoors. I was just having this conversation, and she asked me, that sounds amazing. And she's like, are you ready? And I was like, what do you mean? It's like, what you're proposing, it's like, it's going to take you in different spaces. Are you ready? And I said, I thought like, yeah, sure. Right. Not knowing, understanding that I don't think I understood the question. I thought I did, but no, I didn't. So now to think about, am I ready? Like, how do I share those pieces about what ready meant and not? And how can I present different pieces of me about the learning experience, about the stumbling, about the vulnerability, about what's easy and hard? Otherwise, it can look like you just walk into the space ready, right? This is how you do it. And if you don't do it this way, then you're doing it wrong. and have that presented in my social media so that I hope people can get a better understanding, a more complete picture about what this journey can be. And that even in some of the really crappy, bad spaces, there's a way out, and those can be normal, and there's ways to navigate through them. And at the same time, you don't have to feel less or inferior because you're experiencing that. If everything else that you see just seems amazing, right? Like those old cliches. Here's the hope in your Facebook is as amazing as, or your life is as amazing as you pretend it looks on Facebook.
Yeah. And yeah, like what do you think was one of like the biggest barriers of like sharing that vulnerability? Like really like being able to just be like, yes, like
here's the real questions.
This is me. Yeah.
You know, it's a good question because there's a couple pieces that come up, right? If you make a choice to be present in a public space, that's a commitment. And on social media, there's little you can take back at times, right? Because then if you are going to have and steward a public persona and that develops into a sense of brand, then these expectations can come around, like, well, what are you upholding and what is the brand and what's important? And at the same time, how are you a real person? Because you can be a brand and be totally basically incomplete and fake. Right?
Oh yeah.
But as a real person, for me, it is scary and challenging because being vulnerable, two things. One is you have to acknowledge how you may go against or challenge, especially with others, the construct of what it means to some of the identities that you hold. To be more specific, so take myself, for example. If I am a cisgender heterosexual Latino male, right? How do other people visualize that and hold that? And what's my part in either agreeing or disagreeing with that? If I don't question or challenge some of those pieces, then by default, what I am saying is all these other stereotypes and cliches, I agree with them. And so being vulnerable, then you can't do that as a guy, right? Hell, wearing nail polish, you can't do that as a guy. And then it was important for me because I said, well, this isn't saying, it's saying something about me, but I also want people to recognize what it says about them. All it is nail polish. Is it saying anything more? No, unless I'm actually saying it. So it's interesting to see how others will react to that. And when they're, and ask like, well, what's going on? Like, I'm expanding the definition of what it means to be in this space. And the vulnerability component is important because we're human. We're all human with real emotions. But it's scary, right? Because you have to face the questions of judgment.
Yes.
You have to face the basic questions like, well, what's so-and-so going to think about this? And what if I'm working with somebody and they're like, oh, that's you? Or like, how do we work how do we enter a workspace in which we're doing that? But I made the choice and the challenge, and it's still hard, how do you display that in a way that you feel it's real and not basically the questions that come up will you still be taken seriously, right? Are you still professional enough? Are you still valuable in the ways that you're going to be accepted? But one of the things that has come up for me is knowing that if I'm authentically sharing some of these pieces and it resonates with others and they give that feedback in kind, especially individuals who said, you know what, I was always curious or afraid or not sure how to say that myself, then that's important because that grounds us into the work that we all said that we want to help and support the voices of others.
Yeah.
And sometimes people don't know how they want to say or what they want to say until they get a little sparkle from somebody else to know, like, just, literally what we started at the beginning. Oh, I'm not the only one, right? And that helps give them their voice because then now we're able to hear you. And that helps, trickle down the effect to others. And so that's what I get excited about. Yeah.
And I mean, like, I guess a big thing that like my friends that identify as Latinx have told me about is this concept of like machismo.
Oh, yes.
And so like, I mean, now that you've kind of brought this up, like, like how do you address the feminine energy that comes from, environmental work inevitably, but then how do you make it manly man, but then how do you not be problematic about it?
Yeah.
How do you balance those two things?
Sometimes it's very simple and easy, and sometimes it's not. Two things that come into play is, for me, acknowledging, there's always the work that you need to do in being comfortable with yourself, right? And that can be hard because you may have grown up or come up in a lot of spaces that were never designed to support you or help you find out who you are. They were all a circle of judgments and expectations to keep you in place, but never really to help you then say, well, then who are you? Right? Mm-hmm. So for me, that didn't really come until college, when I was away from home and with new and different people. And that's, for example, that's when I had my first gay friends. And so I didn't grow up with any gay friends. And at best, I could read stuff or see stuff online, and at worst, get all these negative experiences about how that's not normal. And so then to develop those first friendships in college and have it reinforcing each other how normal and human and beautiful an experience it is to get to know different people in that way, that was an example for me to help break that down, but also be a part of it and say hey, guess what? Because I'm also want to be affirmative and supportive spaces does not make me gay. And even just saying that at times, it's look at that. I have to now be much more aware of my language because of how stupid some of this has sounded, right? And so now I still stumble, but it's part of my learning forward, even in the way that I want to be mindful of what gender pronouns to use, of what certain behaviors will do in terms of will they be welcoming and affirming to somebody else? Or am I careless and realize I just affirmed something that's going to trigger something for someone. And part of that is just my own ignorance, or I forgot to check my bias. And sometimes that can be very tiring, right, for a lot of people. But again, it's got to be grounded back to the original commitment. If your agreement is to try to make this better, more courageous, safe, inclusive space, then it means putting the work. And so I have to think about in the ways in which I will continuously affirm my own identity, and also look at the ways that maybe not always directly, sometimes directly, but sometimes indirectly challenge what it means to in my case, for example, be a male or be a guy or be a man. And if someone has a problem with that, to help them understand how that says something about them rather than me, right? Mm-hmm. And that's part of the work. So as examples, we were having this workshop training, and we were looking at the differences between sex, gender, gender expression, fluidity, what are normative behaviors, and saying how you can be, you can be a male, a heterosexual male, and also make choices to express your gender in slightly different ways. And it all depends on what your intention is for why. So I've, done interviews with eye glitter and looking amazing, right? And nail polish, wearing a skirt, and doing all of these things to be able to say how does that affect or impact the work that you want to do? And that's it.
Wow. Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people don't know themselves well enough to realize that.
Hard, though, right?
Yeah, that's layers of work that you have to unbundle values and understandings and fear of judgment and vulnerability to really just get to this stage where you're well, this is me and this is how I express myself. How does that impact the kind of work I'm doing?
Yeah, and the thing is I want to state this clearly, that when and how I share this, it's a learning forward component. This does not make me the most radically progressive individual, right, that has it figured out.
Yeah,
quite the opposite.
Of course.
At best, what it means is I have to be constantly aware of how to be open to the spaces in which others will call me in and call me out about something. And I myself will be intimidated and thinking oh shoot, I'm not as woke as that individual. And or understand that I may not always be holding the best spaces. And guess what? I'm part of the patriarchy, right? And I'm part of them that men are trash, like, and so to hold that space,
Yeah.
and hold it with an intention of how to support and move forward rather than be either defensive about it or guilt or shame, I'm like, then that's part of the work.
Yes, call it out. Do the work. Oh, I love that so much. And yeah, like, how would you encourage like more men to, you know, like use like certain language that encourages like their, I guess, female counterparts or non-gender binary counterparts to like, you know, come on backpacking trips to engage in the outdoors? Because I know like even me as a girl, like I like for a long time thought backpacking and outdoor recreation, to be honest, like was like kind of like a manly, like really intense thing, like where I was like, oh, I could do that, but then I was like, oh, you have to carry like 10 pounds. Oh, you have to like eat only this. I was like, I don't know, it sounded so intense to me to where for some reason my instant image, I really wanted it to be like a woman and even a woman of color, and I just didn't think of it that way. So I don't know, of course I've unlearned that, but what's your advice?
Ooh, that's a good one. You know, we recently were at a training where that question came up, and one example was an individual who was sharing how they're like, well, how am I welcoming and friendly? And I would say, I want to help you carry this because it might be too heavy, but then maybe I don't want to do it because they want to be or and I was like, see, it's a good question, and you can't stick with the paralysis, because if you are in an inequitable system, a lack of action then only further supports inequity, right? And that can sometimes just be an easy cop-out, right? Well, fine, I'm going to be political correct and not do anything. No, that's not what it's about. Because the question I often say is, you can do a couple of things. The first and easy is like flip the script, as they say. Like, how would this look different if you change scenarios and identity? My question was, would you have done the same if it was a guy? Would you have internalized the same set of questions? Or like, would you have offered to help the same? And if they said no, you leave it at that, right? Or would you say, no, he's a guy, he's fine, he's got it. And that's one easy. Separate than like identifying or acknowledging like biological differences, because there's, apart from your gender, there's people that are physically stronger and less physically strong. That's not the point. It's about what are the attached to that difference, and then we further reinforce through behaviors and misinterpretations and stereotypes and biases. Like, to me, that's where it comes from. And then second is the harder work that it takes with the story and the narrative about what's normal come from for you, and how are you putting yourself, challenging yourself to be in different spaces to see how that can be different for the better. So if as a dude or as a guy, where did my understanding and definitions of what that meant come from? And how narrow is that? And where can I look where that's different, where ultimately the question still will come back grounded to you about what are the spaces in when you most feel yourself? Because you can be surprised at how not yourself you can be and feel like trying to uphold constructs that you think are normal, right? It's like, I'm gonna cry, but I can't because so-and-so's going to think that I'm this or I'm weak and whatnot. And if that doesn't really feel you, that's probably a thing to like look at and be able to like, wow, how could it be different to be like, hey, you are going to cry. That's going to feel like better and normal for you. And you're going to be a space where that's affirmed and it doesn't take away from whatever other identities of strength that you have.
Yes, I think that is so important, because it again comes down to unlearning some things that have been so deeply embedded and conditioned with. And so, I mean, I hope that people listening, get something really meaningful out of, the statements you just shared and the stories you just shared, because I think that something that you just need to kind of light the spark on and really get people thinking about it. And, if you don't listen to things like this, like where else are you going to find out about it, I guess?
That's true. You need to, that's the work that we can all do, right? How to provide experiences and create spaces for others. Because it's just something we were laughing about it when we first watched A Wrinkle in Time, which was like I really like that movie.
I need to watch it.
Right. But we were amusing because it's like Oprah, shows up as just this amazing being and so wise. And we're thinking, sometimes I just want these moments where Space Oprah is going to show up and say something amazing and profound, right? And we're like, so for example, like, Space Oprah, like, what do I need to learn today, right? And like, it's going to come back, child. It's not what you need to learn. It's what you need to unlearn. And we're like,
Space Oprah!
Yes.
That's awesome. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, this hour is zooming by so fast. I could talk to you for hours, to be honest. There's so much I want to know.
It's all fine. I have time, but maybe your listeners don't.
But I just want to know, who's someone who really inspires you and inspires your work?
Ooh, that's a good question. I sometimes struggle because it's not like I have one individual or people. I mean, even if you look on Instagram, I have so many people that inspire me. All of the leaders of Latino Outdoors are highly inspiring because they all come with such an amazing story. And the fact that they make a commitment and have made a contribution to growing this idea, I tell them it's like, remember, there's that video of, I think it's actually a TED Talk about like how to start a movement. And it's the one individual dancing. I don't know if you've seen it.
No, I haven't.
It's like, on this hill at this kind of like everybody's sitting down and one individual gets up and just starts moving like crazy. Actually, let me restate that. They're moving wildly and all over the place so that people might look at them and be like, what are they doing? But all it takes is another individual to get up and join them and be like, hey, I'm part of this too. And then you get to a point maybe after 3 or 4 that others are looking. It's like, why am I not a part of that? And so what may be atypical or seem out of the norm at the beginning becomes normal because it's really that second and third and fourth individual that say, I believe in you to be able to do this. And that's what a lot of the volunteers have done, right? Like this could have been just me with a blog post and there it was. But collectively we built that, and other individuals are doing that now too. Yourself, of course, right? Like the question is, what prompted you to do this? And the work that it takes to do this, the emotional energy and time that you have to make. Individuals online like Danielle Williams from Melanin Base Camp, Jenny Brusso from Unlikely Hikers, Karen Ramos, Nature Chola, and Breen from Brown People Camping, that they all said, I believe in something and want to put it out there, and others will rally behind that. So they inspire me. And then lastly, what inspires me is an acknowledgement of all the individuals that have come before and are still here with us, and some who are not. There are individuals that are not on social media, but they've been doing the work for generations. Dr. Carolyn Finney, Audrey Peterman, Teresa Baker, Juan Martinez, all the way back to Lourdes Huertas, Cesar Chavez. We have a lot of movement builders back from the day that they all believed in something. And of course, they didn't have an Instagram account. Some of them now do, but that's not where they invested. You have leaders that, the leaders of in the 1990s and 1980s and 70s and 60s who stood up for something. And that's why that sense of history is always important to me too, and go back and say, like, this individual decided that something was important. And I look back and say, how inspiring is that to step into a space that you want to build and create, and that others will believe in as well and invest in it.
I love it. And to finish off with my last question, I just want to know, what's your advice to other Latinx Americans and elsewhere on how they can like plug into Latino Outdoors? Why should they plug in, and how can they connect with you on Insta?
Right. Well, the easy part for Instagram is just find me. It's at Jose Bilingue. Jose Bilingue on Instagram, also same on Twitter and Facebook. And I mean, plugging into Latino Outdoors at latinooutdoors.org is that we've been working on building that community and now network and organization. And just reach out, right? There's different ways for people to contribute, and even join on a hike or an outdoor experience, or eventually become a leader. I'm amazed by some of the individuals that like are out there leading in Colorado and New York and Seattle and San Antonio, all these places where they're like, I believe in them, I'm going to do that out there. And it also can mean you starting your own account or reaching out to others. Like it's so beautiful to see individuals come in with their identity in that Instagram community, for example. I remember the first couple of people who were like Cholos Outdoors and Envato Mentalist, and like as a way to kind of like put the little stake of identity in there. And that's how you can build community, seeing all these individuals expressing themselves. So I think it's just a matter of reaching out and saying hi. And sometimes I'm amused sometimes because people feel like, I don't know, like, how do you reach out to somebody that you don't know? Or maybe that you might idolize a little bit. And it's like, well, can I just say hi? It's like, yeah, you can. Be surprised how we're all like beautiful human beings with the same set of insecurities.
Amazing. Yeah. And really quick, last statement. What makes you the most proud to be a Latino American environmentalist?
Oh, shoot. So I say, Mexicano or Mexican by birth nationality. I am a quote unquote American U.S. citizen by naturalization. I'm a Latinx by cultural identity and affirmation. I'm Chicano by social political identity, and I'm Hispanic by census count. So what makes me really proud is knowing that I am on a journey and have been transitioning from going from a sense of shame about what that meant, growing up and knowing that I was Mexican was so hard and negative. It had all the negative connotations that I could think of. Literally, I didn't even want some of my friends to know where I lived. I didn't want them to see how poor I was, even though they were my friends. And I had my set of white friends and my set of Mexican friends, and never did they meet or mix, like once. And it was kind of like that weird, awkward moment. But knowing that then I came with that set of like what I call an ambicultural identity, right? On one end, I'm going to quinceañeras. Another end, I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons. Latinx nerd identity that I created to transition, especially college and after that, to be a sense of pride, and now to try to help others like ground themselves with that. Because sometimes some of the space has not changed. It's, especially in this political climate, we're throwing everything about like how to feel bad and negative about being brown or even deadly, but like to be Latinx can come so negatively charged. And so for me to be like, no, this can now be a sense of pride, and this is the history that we carried. I'm really proud about that, because then it's affirming like, hey, if you're gonna use terms like American, guess what? That includes all of us.
I love that so much. Well, thank you everyone for joining this episode of Brown Girl Green. I'm Christy Drutman, and I interview environmental leaders and advocates about workplace and member diversity and inclusion. I'm working to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. Thank you.
Adios.